Hey, I'm Shane McGalley.
I'm David Keener.
How to do, Steve Moriarty.
And this is the Hourlings podcast project. Tonight, we're going to talk about something really specific: active voice. I wanted to start this podcast off by actually reading the definition right out of Wikipedia of it. So I'm just gonna read it right from the website. Active voice is a writing style in which the subject of a sentence performs the action rather than being acted upon. So in other words, when writing an active voice, the subject of the sentence is the one doing something rather than having something done to them. I'll give you a basic example. Dave threw the ball. That's active voice. Okay. Passive voice would be the ball was thrown by Dave. Active voice, one, is kind of easier to write, and two, it's more engaging for a reader. When you're doing the subject and then the action, it is easier to follow. I personally had a really super hard time with passive voice when I first started as a writer. I think that it was the biggest modifications my earliest editors had to shake their head and, modify in my writing. But I'm doing a lot better with it.
Well,
So what about you guys? How are you guys with active voice?
I think there's some obvious reasons for that, though, because I think we tend to learn passive voice first for book reports in school and all kinds of reports. And in my day job, it's all technical computer related reports and stuff. And those things tend to be passive voice, where you're emphasizing emphasizing what is happening and not who is doing it. So it's something like the Grand Canyon is visited by thousands of tourists every year. If you were writing a report about tourism, and not who is visiting the
Well,
canyon.
I think actually the larger subject is important, because if you're writing about the Grand Canyon, or you're writing an ad for the Grand Canyon, you might say that. But if you're writing a study on tourism, in America, I think maybe you would say tourists visit the Grand Canyon, in droves or whatever.
Right. That's really the hardest thing about it is, what's the main subject of in the paragraph, in the sentence, in the page, in the story?
So what I do is I look for the keywords was and were, or if you're writing present tense, are and is. And I remember my first novel, like I did a literal search of every use of the word was, and I checked to make sure that I could not change that instance to active voice. In many places I could. So yeah, I mean, I think it tightens up your writing. It makes it, as Marty was saying, the psychology of it just works better for readers when they're reading subject and action. They just see it better. And one thing else that I was noticing when you read that description, Marty, from the website, was active voice is almost like the micro version of having a character who does something. For example, an active character who's not passive, an active protagonist who acts, who is not acted upon. So when you're writing, I mean, the craft of writing is all about like synchronizing this, right? Having on the macro level it being active, and having on the micro level your sentences being active. It's all a combination.
Yeah, it's a really good tip, the was thing.
Yeah,
because that is a major fingerprint for passive voice.
My experience is a little different. I think I find myself typically in the first draft using a lot of passive voice. What I find I prefer to do is sometimes set the scene with a passive voice, but when the characters start doing what they're going to do in that chapter, that becomes active. And there's a kind of a notable change, and it enlivens the scene. I agree with you. It makes it more bold, more direct when it's active. But if you're describing how the traffic is going, the river is flowing, these sorts of things, that's where the passive is more useful, and also accentuates the difference when you jump into the active voice.
That's a good point. Another place where you actually have to use passive voice is when you don't know who the subject was. For example, the table was set, but maybe the character doesn't know who set the table. right? So there are instances where you have to use passive voice. But I think the main thing is catching instances where you really shouldn't be, or you really can't.
Yeah, so I agree with Steve. I think that there are cases where, I hate to play devil's advocate. No, who am I kidding? I like playing devil's advocate. There are places where passive can be more subtle about getting a point across than active voice. So I think it can be used, but judiciously, and you should kind of check: do you really need to use it there? Is it serving a purpose? And if not, I would typically do active voice.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you learn the rule and then you can break it at will. Because I've read stories where as the POV changes, subtly, one of the POV characters would have a lot more passive voice associated with them. And it creates a completely different tone in the story when you actually intentionally insert passive voice. It's a really subtle writing technique that completely evades me, and I will never do that.
I got a question for you guys. Now, I've written over 1 million words of fiction, but I'm always learning. And so recently, I was corrected in my use of what I thought was active voice, but the editor said that it just wasn't correct. And I want to see, I'm still a little confused about it, so I want to explain it to you guys. So when you have a sentence that says, Marty was standing versus Marty stood, I thought that Marty stood would be active voice, but the editor told me that Marty stood means Marty rose from a chair rather than was standing. So for example, you would say Marty was standing in the doorway to explain that he's actually standing, versus Marty stood in the doorway would mean that he rose from a seat or rose from a sitting position in a doorway. What do you guys think?
I think that's debatable.
Yeah.
I think that either of those would work. I think you'd need a little wider context to know which was right.
I will say I tend to eliminate statements like Marty was standing, because I feel like I could probably do more to set the stage. Marty stood defiantly, in the doorway or something.
But if you said that, I wouldn't think that Marty was rising from a sitting position. I would think he was already standing.
Yeah.
So I guess this all goes to show that it can get a little confusing when you're looking at, was and certain verbs that dictate different things. But as Marty said, it's all, context. And
so Steve, when you're writing, do you actually keep, subtle rules like active voice in your head as you're writing, or you just go with it?
Froze, unfreeze. Did you hear that, Steve?
Yes.
Okay.
In my view, to be honest, I don't get too fixated on it, but it's one of those things, falling back to my legal background, it's like one of the Supreme Court justices said long ago, he had a hard time defining pornography, but he knew what it looked like when he saw it. When you've written a chapter and you go back and look at it and think, yeah, that's I've gone the wrong way. It's without even thinking about it, you realize it's passive. You want to turn it around and be more direct and give more strength to it. And that comes from the active voice.
Yeah,
the bad habit I find is it's too easy to write passive. You tend to fall into that. And I think when you all said earlier, that's what you were taught early on, and that's probably right.
Yeah. I tend to also find that I'm not a real purist. Like I'm trying to get a story across to the reader, and I will sacrifice the rules in order to have something that sounds cool to the reader and really paints a picture for him. That's, again, knowing the rules and breaking the rules.
Yeah, I'm with you. Context is really important. Because if you have a line that says something like, the assassin aimed the gun at the target, sometimes it's a little matter of fact. And if you're using active voice, you got to tread the line of telling versus showing as well, which is another complicated rule that you have to watch out for.
Another instance where active voice might not be the best is when something else happens in conjunction with the event, or something happened after an event. For example, you could say the assassin was aiming the gun at the target when the cops burst through the door, you know?
Yeah.
Or I was eating, if you're telling someone a story, yeah, I was eating pizza when he arrived. You know, you wouldn't say I ate pizza when he arrived. So yeah.
Yeah, you got to be careful too with active voice in dialogue. Don't make your dialogue sound clunky by following a strict active voice rule, because people talk in passive voice all the time.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I try to be as natural as possible with that, and I also try to make sure that people sort of talk elliptically, because nobody really says, I feel like this and I feel like this other thing and stuff. It's one of the things that really annoys me about my wife's soap operas that she watches.
Yeah. I don't know, man. I mean, it's
so do we have anything else to add about active voice? I can detail a few examples that I have written down over here.
Sure.
Yeah.
Here's just a few examples. And keep in mind the main subject and then the action. That's the total rule. So I'll just read some of these off. The dragon breathed fire over the village. Active voice. The detective solved the mystery with his sharp intuition. The waves crashed against the rocks with a deafening roar. All of those are active voice. The villain plotted revenge in secret.
You could also say the rocks cracked under the pressure of the waves, right? You doesn't have to necessarily, the subject isn't necessarily rigid. You can move it around.
Yeah, the interesting part is that the author has to decide which is the primary subject of the sentence. And because you can, if you're talking about Dave and the ball, either of those could be the subject. But which one's more important? I always put those first.
It's always Dave that's more important.
It's always Dave.
Duh.
It's all about
So
Dave.
the ball is never thrown by Dave. Passive voice.
I guess my last word, if we're doing last words, or are we?
Go ahead, last words.
Last words. Yeah, my last words, I mean, I thought that this episode would be a lot more like rigidly in support of active voice, always, every time, that kind of thing. But the more we talked about it, the more I realized that there were some gray areas. So I thought that was, it evolved in an interesting way.
Yeah, definitely gray. And in fact, as I'm hammering through my first draft, I never think about it.
Yeah.
In subsequent drafts, I will do a pass through the entire book looking for passive voice that I need to destroy. So,
Dave, Steve, any last words?
Yeah,
I
don't believe in must follow at all times rules. And active voice, passive voice, that's just another rule.
Yep.
I guess the only thing I would add, without completely repeating what I said earlier, is if it depends, to me at least, on the mood you're trying to set in that scene, and mood may be helped by the passive voice, but then the characters will enliven it through the active voice.
Yep.
Yeah,
it's good.
That's a good technique.
Well, I guess that's it for tonight. And Steve, thanks for stopping in.
Thanks, Steve.
I'm glad I was in the neighborhood.
Okay. Take care, and we'll see you all next week.
Good. Thank you.